It's Locked On NFL on a Friday. It is the quarterback show. We're going to go through all things quarterbacks, guys that aren't in the league and guys that won't be in the league much longer. Lauren and I are going to cover all of that in just a second here on Locked On NFL on a Friday.
You are Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on here on a Friday on Locked On NFL? I am Tony Wiggins. He is Lauren Cox, and we are driving this ship today on a Friday here on Locked On NFL, where it's your team every day. And we always thank you for making us your first listen. We are also free to subscribe to on our YouTube page. All you got to do is swing on over to YouTube. That is Locked On NFL. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and then hit the bell so that you receive notifications each and every time we drop an episode. Wherever you listen to your audio podcast, when you're at lunch or running or driving, we certainly don't want you watching your screen. Find out wherever you listen to those podcasts and make sure you tap into that location every single day so you don't miss an episode and you can become an everydayer. I have covered this NFL now for about 21 years. Lauren, how long has it been for you? And hello.
Tony, I won't tell you how old I am, so you don't feel old by the number of years you've been covering this. But I was just a wee lad when you started covering the NFL.
Yeah. So you actually kind of did make me feel old, but it's all good. If the gray beard don't do it, ain't nothing else gonna hurt my feelings, right?
If I keep the beard shorter like this, I'm starting to get the grays in there, so I'm catching up to you one way or another. But I've seen a lot of NFL drafts. So, I'd give myself, I don't know where are we at now, 24. So I don't know, I'd give myself maybe 15 or so. And
yeah,
I don't know. As you and I were kind of talking about before we started recording, like the quarterbacks at the top don't feel like they have the same kind of excitement that they used to. And you probably have an even longer tail of feeling that, especially I think it felt like in the early 2000s, especially like drafting a quarterback was a monumental thing for a franchise. And now it feels a little more run of the mill.
It does. And a little working theory that I have here. One, I covered the Jaguars. You covered the Bears. The Bears have a number one pick this year, and obviously they're going to take a quarterback. The Jaguars in 2021, or was it 2020? I think it was 2021. They took Trevor Lawrence, and the whole city was turned upside down, man. But what has happened since then, and even slightly before then, Josh Allen wasn't the number one pick. Patrick Mahomes wasn't the number one pick. C.J. Stroud wasn't the number one pick. And those are the guys that people are really, really talking about that have been drafted over the last several years, handful of years, under 10 years, that are considered. Joe Burrow's the only exception, but Justin Herbert was also not number one. I think a little bit of the luster is going away from the number one. And I thought about this when I thought about basketball, and people were saying, have you ever seen people more excited about a draft than Patrick Ewing? And I said, no, in my lifetime, I have never, ever, ever seen anyone get more excited than the New York Knicks fans did when Patrick Ewing, because how dominant he was at Georgetown. And that's 30 some odd years ago. But over the years, even at the quarterback position, whether it was Andrew Luck, even Jameis Winston to a certain extent, there used to just be this excitement about that position. It's changed now. Now it's like folks are like, okay, let's see, is he gonna make it or is he not? And I just think that's a dynamic that people are missing. My theory is that because those other guys have been successful and you've had so many guys that went number one, people were skeptical about Cam Newton, remember? But then he did whatever he did. But you had so many guys that went number one that didn't turn out to be, even Andrew Luck, by his shortened career. People just don't get as excited about that anymore.
Yeah, I think especially when you look at this year's draft with Caleb Williams, like the Bears had such a kind of a messy, I mean, messy is maybe not the right word, but just a less than ideal departure of Justin Fields, right? And such a passion from the fan base of support for Fields, and a lot of, a good, it's pretty close to 50-50 in Chicago as far as the debate between should they draft Caleb Williams or keep Justin Fields. Like when half of the fan base is left feeling like, man, we just got rid of the quarterback that I wanted and I believed in, and now we got to bring in this new guy. Like I think as we get closer to the draft and as it feels more real and once it actually happens, I think there will be a warmer embrace overall, but it still kind of feels like not quite ready to move on and feels like, all right, like we'll try it with this guy, but especially like the Bears and I think some of these other downtrodden franchises. I mean, I think the Jaguars aren't quite that old as a franchise to have the same thing, but certainly there was aspects of this in the past with even I think the Bengals coming into Joe Burrow a little bit, where it's like you've seen bad quarterback after bad quarterback come into your franchise and be drafted very, very highly. You know, we just moving on from Justin Fields. I don't think is a bad quarterback, but not an unsuccessful quarterback in Justin Fields and Mitch Trubisky before that. So I think a lot of Bears fans are left going, okay, why is this one going to be different? Why am I supposed to think Caleb Williams is going to be great when I thought Justin Fields was going to be great and I thought Mitch Trubisky was supposed to be great? And so, fool me twice, shame on me. What are we doing? Fool me three times. I would say it like George Bush. I can never get the phrase right, but like, that's what it ends up feeling like to me. It's like, all right, like you think Caleb Williams can be great, but our Bears fans aren't ready to have their heart broken again so quickly.
Yeah. And a lot of teams, by the way, it's fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice. You ain't gonna fool me again. Something like that, right? But it was hilarious. I'm glad. The funny part is you forgot it, and he forgot it, and that's why it was so funny, right? So no, but I do think it's fans are taking this watch and see approach. We're gonna attach this to something because a lot of times we have these discussions and we either leave it open ended or do what we just did and we come up with solutions. But there is a reason. There's a structural reason in the NFL. I call it, everybody says not for long. We need to change the acronym to CYA. That's what it is. It's cover your you know what, because coaches are often trying to save themselves. GMs are often trying to save themselves. What happens when a team picks a quarterback, but then they change GMs who's not married to that player and doesn't and has no interest in, has no ulterior motive, rather, for that guy to be successful because he can always say, it wasn't on my watch. So a lot of this also is, it's the NFL that's changing. There was a debate that I saw on social media last night about why one of our Locked On hosts in Atlanta put the question out is, you're getting Kirk Cousins, why wouldn't you just go ahead and draft a guy in this draft like Michael Penix if he's there in the second round? And because Cousins is like 61 years old or whatever, coming off of an injury, and you'll have a guy in place. And he got into it emphatically with somebody that says that's the old NFL. No one does that. They're paying Kirk Cousins for the next 2 or 3 years. Everything is done in 2 or 3 year increments, and nobody's going to want to do that and get fired. So while I disagree with it, I definitely understand the sentiment, and that's what we're going to get into here in a second, because we're going to talk about the fact that ain't nobody got patience for babies. And the babies that we're talking about here are young quarterbacks. It seems like the teams that do have patience get it right. The teams that don't have patience, they get it wrong. Those are the things that we're going to discuss in segment number 2 here on Locked On NFL on a Friday.
This episode of Locked On NFL is brought to you by our friends at Robinhood. Robinhood is here to help with your 401k investing needs. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still get an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at Robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of the first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA is available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer.
All right, segment number 2 here on Locked On NFL. Lauren Cox, Locked On Bears, along with me, Tony Wiggins, the normal host of the Locked On Jaguars podcast. But David Harrison is on another assignment. So Lauren was happy enough to join me today here on Locked On NFL for the Friday edition of the show. So we talked about in the first segment on our quarterback show that there's no love for number one the way it used to be. And I'm fine with it, right? Because back then there were so many expectations that number one had to come in and he had to play well, or as a general rule, had to at least match the excitement and the optimism of the fans with his play enough that people were going to be carrying over that optimism into year two. Well, now we just discussed at the end of the segment that there's no love for young quarterbacks because outside of Green Bay, no one has the interest in really doing what Green Bay did with Jordan Love, which has been a success. It's the same thing that they did with Aaron Rodgers almost 20 years ago, which was a success. We'll get to him later too. The thing is though, who's going to break that mold? Who's going to be the team that when they're going to have enough patience to draft that guy right now and let him wait? They're going to have to draft the right person who waits. And the other thing is they're going to have to explain to the fans that they won't get instant gratification from their first overall pick or their second round pick. I think a lot of this has to fall on the league. The lack of development, not only at quarterback, but the other positions, it comes from bad management. And I always say this: more bad teams and bad organizations ruin good players than bad players ruin good teams.
I think that's a great saying. I don't think I've heard that one before, but you're right. I mean, you look at even somebody like the Tennessee Titans just a couple years ago, going from Malik Willis in the third round and then turning around and drafting Will Levis in the second round and not really giving either quarterback a ton of time or patience or runway to become what they could potentially be. And I think a lot of this has to do with the rookie wage scale, right? Like back in the day when Sam Bradford was the number one overall pick, he came in as one of the higher paid quarterbacks in the league. And it was like, all right, like you're stuck with this guy. You're paying him a lot of money over the next 4 or 5 years. So you got to find a way to make it work and do whatever you can to be successful with him. And you get locked into that guy for a while. But now, even the number one overall pick, or, like I was just looking at CJ Stroud's contract, like year one was like $6.5 million cap hit. Year two is like 8 million. Year three is 9 million. And then year four is like 11. Like that's not peanuts, but it's much easier to not only build a team around that quarterback, but also if for whatever reason you want to move on from a Justin Fields after 3 years, like it only costs the Steelers $2 million to trade for him from the Bears. Like it's not cost prohibitive to move on from these quarterbacks or to add more quarterbacks in the draft and stack a couple of them in there, as opposed to using an early pick on a guy and just being stuck with a big salary. And you got to find a way to make it work with him. And you're forced to be patient financially.
And unlike basketball, and I'll use that example again, I remember when Philly took Jerry Stackhouse one year, he was like one of the best rookies in the league. The very next year they took Allen Iverson and they found out they couldn't play together because Allen Iverson was going to be the alpha, right? So the thing about it is it probably could have worked because those in basketball, two guys can play at the same time. In the NFL, two quarterbacks don't play at the same time. Nobody listens to the backup. You have to have a clear number one that everybody is going to get behind. And I had a veteran tell me a long time ago that if a coach does it right, he doesn't have to choose who the quarterback is. The team will choose because all you got to do is observe and watch, and they'll follow the leader. They'll follow the leader. That means having more than one guy in the building competing. And I think that's where we're starting to head. It's going to start looking like college a little bit, where because there isn't a huge penalty in getting a number one overall pick, because you don't have to give them Sam Bradford money, right? I think you're going to see more and more teams invest day one and day two picks on their quarterback position, even when they already have one. Another reason you want to do it is this. How many times have we seen teams that are in contention? Although Cleveland bucked this last year, they're in contention. They lose their guy. Cleveland lost their second guy, their third guy, and got to their fourth guy, and they made a run to the playoffs. I also believe by adding more quarterbacks like the NFL, now teams are going to have 3 on every roster. I also believe now those backup positions won't just be dedicated to clipboard holders or guys that are older, bridging the gap for young players. I think it's going to be a more competitive, unless you have one of those guys that's top 10, it's going to be now moving forward a more competitive environment, and the winner has to just get it where he can. And because you're not spending all of this money on it, because you're not paying them $50 million, it enables these teams to be able to do that and have a more patient outlook on these quarterbacks. And I hope that's where we're going, because it really, really hurts the game when you have a revolving door at one or two organizations at the quarterback position. The Jaguars had dudes running in and out of here every 3 or 4 years, and they were constantly starting over. Luckily for them, everyone's opinion around here of Trevor Lawrence was so high that they didn't just look at it as, oh Lord, here we go again. But for a lot of teams, they just don't have that. Y'all are doing it for the second time in 3 years now. And really, if you look back at Mitch Trubisky, it's the third time in about 8 or 9 years that they're doing it in Chicago.
Yeah, that's what makes it so challenging here. But I like the idea of like more teams investing more in quarterbacks and not just saying like the famous quote from, I think it was Tom Moore, was the Colts offensive coordinator or quarterbacks coach with Peyton Manning, where when their backup was, I think, Jim Sorgi, somebody asked him at practice, like, why aren't you giving Sorgi any reps in the offense behind Peyton Manning? He said, because if 18 comes out, then we're effed, and we don't practice effed. So they just said, screw it. Like we're all in on the starter. But I think as we get to, 17 game seasons, and we saw pretty much every single team had to go through multiple different quarterbacks in some capacity, or a bunch of different teams had QB injuries, or in the last couple seasons have had to start multiple quarterbacks over the course of the year. Like the value of the number 2 QB is going up. And when we see guys like Joe Flacco come off the street and be successful, like you mentioned, or Josh Dobbs gets traded twice in the same year, comes to Minnesota, and certainly didn't win a starting job long term, but at least looked manageable for a little while. Gardner Minshew played himself into a bigger role, and I think we could find more Geno Smiths over the years too, of guys that had that too quick of a hook early on in their career, or maybe needed to sit down and never got the chance to, and then they were forced to, but stuck it out and got another chance later on and can turn things around. Like it feels like there should be more of those guys, someone like a Mitch Trubisky or a Justin Fields 3 or 4 or 5 years from now that never had that chance and really could have used more of that time to develop. And if they can hit that pause in their career, accept a backup role, and maybe still get some occasional playing time, that could kind of end up being a win-win for all parties.
I'm going to show my age here, and maybe fans will think about what we're saying in this respect. When I was a kid, the Dallas Cowboys had Roger Staubach as their quarterback. They were my arch rivals because I rooted for Washington. I knew who their backup quarterback, his name was Danny White. And when Staubach retired, Danny White took over. I knew who Phil Simms' backup was in New York. It was a guy named Jeff Hostetler who went and won a Super Bowl. The Washington team that I, covered, they had at one point, it was Joe Theismann, and he was backed up by Jay Schrader, who took over when Theismann was hurt on Monday night. And he was the quarterback for a while until he wasn't, because he got hurt. Doug Williams came in and won the Super Bowl MVP right after that. You always knew who the backup guy was, and he was a guy that's in development. I think guys like Jameis Winston, I want these teams to start having the same backup. If you're going to have the same starter for 10 years, have the same backup for 10 years too. You talk about continuity. When they start figuring that out, Doug Peterson, the coach here in Jacksonville, was Donovan McNabb's backup for a long time. When you do it that way, I think it creates another job opportunity for a dude that's going to get paid pretty good, right? And it also will allow these teams to create continuity. Another thing that they can do is develop players and not rush guys. The 2 guys that we're going to talk about in segment 3 were guys that were not rushed. But first, I have to let you guys know, if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, have to turn down the volume with all that shouting, like you mute it and you still hear them. Well, make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the best and biggest stories without all that screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels at part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Who has the better season? Aaron Rodgers coming back off an injury in New York, or Josh Allen, and he ain't got nobody right now to throw the ball to? We're going to discuss that in segment 3 here on Locked On NFL.
This episode of Locked On NFL is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. We're talking superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit. Only available to U.S. customers.
All right, third, final segment here on the Friday edition of Locked On NFL. Lauren Cox joining me, Tony Wiggins, and we are talking quarterbacks. First segment, no love for the number one quarterback like it used to be, no patience for babies. Now we're going to talk about an older guy who's far from a baby and another dude who is probably far from a baby too. But at one point they were treated like babies because they both had kid gloves when they were drafted to their respective teams. We're talking about Aaron Rodgers, who is now a New York Jet, and I'm talking about Josh Allen, who is still a Buffalo Bill. The reason why I brought those two guys up is because this was actually a topic where I was going to ask just about Aaron Rodgers and what it is we expected, because I saw that they actually debated on TV. Does he need to be MVP Aaron Rodgers in order for them to be good? I don't think so. But he's coming off Achilles injury. He's been nicked up a lot over the last 5 years. There's always something, and that's what happens when you get old, right? Josh Allen loses his number 2 receiver and Gabe Davis to Jacksonville, and then surprisingly this week had his number 1 receiver traded away. And I'm thinking, well, who's he going to throw the ball to? It's got to be Dalton Kincaid, right? But he needs help. So because those weapons are gone, he's going to have to get used to new people, not in free agency, obviously in the draft. Who's going to have the better year between those two? Aaron Rodgers, who may get Brock Bowers to go along with Garrett Wilson. Who's going to have the better year, Aaron Rodgers or Josh Allen?
I'd still put my money on Josh Allen, but I think it's going to be an interesting case study here, because a lot of the narrative around Josh Allen was, that year 3 jump that he took where he went from, reckless, bad, over aggressive quarterback to MVP candidate every year was when Stephon Diggs arrived. Like, that was the unlocking. It's like, oh, pair the young QB with a big name, big time wide receiver, and that unlocks his full potential. Then the Eagles did that with AJ Brown and Jalen Hurts, and I think the Bears try to do that with Justin Fields and DJ Moore. Like, that was supposed to be the formula. So now that he's been built up to this great quarterback and has been producing consistently, now if you take away that number 1 quarterback, does he revert back to that? I don't think he will. There have been games without Stephon Diggs where he just doesn't completely revert. I believe in Josh Allen as being, a consistently productive quarterback. And I feel like they're in still a good spot to add at wide receiver in the NFL draft. They get the 28th pick and the 60th pick, plus a couple of 4th and 5th round picks. I think if they stay at 28, they can still get a really good wide receiver like a Brian Thomas Jr. from LSU, or Xavier Worthy from Texas, or maybe A.D. Mitchell from Texas, Ladd McConkey from Georgia. Like, there's a bunch of wide receivers right in that range, or they have some wiggle room to move up and get one if there's a player they prefer there. And I feel like any of those guys that I mentioned can plug and play and not be as good as Stephon Diggs, and probably not be 1,000-yard guys as year 1, but you pair them with Curtis Samuel, who they signed this offseason, and there's a lot to like about Khalil Shakir. And then you mentioned Dalton Kincaid and then Dawson Knox. Like, it's not a great set of weapons, but I think it's enough where Josh Allen can be close to the same amount of productive. It's just going to be a little bit harder for him.
I think the receivers that you mentioned in Shakir and Curtis Samuel, the one thing that they do is, and Samuel used to be a running back, so this makes total sense. If you get past all the route running, which I'm sure that they both run routes, I think Shakir does anyway. Those are guys that can turn into running backs once you get on the ball. And in a certain type of offense, especially one where your quarterback isn't necessarily on schedule all the time, it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm gonna throw it when you come out of your break. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, spin. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. There you go. So that, you know what I'm saying? It's almost like these dudes can turn into mini punt returners, right? I think if you get one big guy, you start leaning heavy on those 2 tight end sets, I think Josh Allen is going to be fine. Now, I do believe he has an issue with throwing some balls. Sometimes he shouldn't. And that's what happens when you start feeling good about yourself. And I don't think coaches want to stop all of that stuff. But Aaron Rodgers, to me, besides all of the stuff that people may agree with or disagree with about his demeanor and about some of the things that he says that some may qualify as weird, some may find it normal, we forget how good that dude is, man. I'm, as far as throwing the ball, I don't remember seeing 4 guys in my lifetime that could throw the ball like that. I'm just being totally honest with you, and I think I still can anticipate a little bit that he'll be able to do those things. His biggest asset is going to be, if they do get Brock Bowers in the draft, a guy who he can hit with quick passes out in the flat, who can break tackles. But his biggest friend is going to probably be Breece Hall, and the fact that they also added a few big offensive linemen to help ease things up. He's going to have to do what he did his last year in Green Bay. Turn around and hand that ball off and throw a bunch of short passes and then set it up to where he can go downfield to Garrett Wilson. I'm sure, I don't know how he's going to be, 39, 40 years old. At some point, there's always a turn where this stuff goes bad. And hopefully for Aaron Rodgers, we'll get a chance to see. So I'm going to answer the question for you. I think Aaron Rodgers is going to have a better season. But it's contingent on the fact that he has to stay healthy. He has to stay healthy.
I guess part of this is how do you define who has the, better season? I mean, is that number passing yards, or is that number how the offense ranks in points? Because I mean, Josh Allen over the last 4 years, his worst season over the last 4 years is as good as Aaron Rodgers' best season over the last 5 years in terms of passing yards. Now, I think Rodgers has had, especially a couple, like one of those years was Rodgers' MVP years, back-to-back MVP years. His best year was 4,300 yards, essentially. That's what Josh Allen gets at like a minimum every year. But yards is not always the measurement of who was the better quarterback there. Like I think Josh Allen can be the more productive quarterback, but Aaron Rodgers could have the better season because he's got, like you mentioned, Breece Hall on that offensive line. Like the Jets offense could run the ball a bit more. They could play a little bit more conservatively if they don't need Rodgers to throw 40 times a game, and maybe his numbers are lesser than Josh Allen. But in terms of like, you watch the two quarterbacks and say which one of these guys is playing better, I could see that one being Aaron Rodgers.
Same. I could also see that. And the good thing about it is they're in the same division, so we're going to see them beat up on each other twice, and that's going to be a big deal. And then if Aaron Rodgers does anything good in New York, it's going to be amplified. It's just going to, even though Buffalo's in the state of New York, I'm talking about New York City. But since we're on quarterbacks, I got to say this. There's going to be a dude in Cincinnati that's going to say, allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Joe B. And I'm telling you, he is going to have a big, big season this year.
I don't disagree with you. He's ready for that bounce back. But just like the Bills traded Stephon Diggs, what if they trade T. Higgins and then it's just Jamar Chase and what else? I bet they'll probably keep T. Higgins, but that becomes an interesting debate of like, okay, can the Jamar Chase show be like what it used to be with AJ Green and Andy Dalton, where it was kind of just the one big receiver who could get all the yards, but how far can you go with just all the yards through one guy?
I think if I'm them, I keep him. Because people saying, well, you can't have a franchise quarterback making that money and two franchise receivers. You can have one franchise quarterback and one receiver. I don't think Jamar Chase is going to get mad that T. Higgins makes all that money for this year. And I tag him again, and then next year I trade him. But I would get that production this year before I have to put Chase on that extension. All right, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. I got to ask you before we leave. I know this is a football show. Who you got winning it all, man? I think UConn's going to win it. I'm going chalk. I'm going UConn and South Carolina. UConn for the men, South Carolina for the women.
I'll definitely go UConn for the men. I'm not a big Purdue fan, and I'm hoping they take Zach Edey out there. I'm tired of watching his big, lanky self dominate me there, even though like that's me, just a little bit shorter. Women's side, though, I think Caitlin Clark's going to finish the Cinderella, not Cinderella story, but finish the fairy tale ending of her college career and ride off into the WNBA as a college basketball champion.
If I'm not mistaken, that's the last team to beat South Carolina, too, isn't it?
I think so.
All right, man. So we got that in. You got everything today, man. We made NBA references. We talked about quarterbacks. We talked about Roger Staubach. We talked about Caitlin Clark and basketball.
George Bush as well. We got
George Bush, right? We didn't. Yeah, we mentioned George Bush. Fool me once, it's on me. Fool me twice. Well, you never fool me again. All right, and we ain't trying to fool you again here on Locked On NFL. Make sure you check in all weekend. Of course, Locked On Podcast Network is always first, and it's your first listen of the day, and it's your team every day. And last but not least, here's what's going to happen. You're going to check back in Monday and you're going to see Kevin Ostraker. That's right, because we are your team every day. I want y'all to have a nice weekend. Make sure y'all take care of each other. For Lauren Cox, I am Tony Wiggins. This is Locked On NFL. We'll see you.